largest single movement of troops since World War II began. The president emphasized it was to defend Saudi Arabia, not to liberate Kuwait.
To assume Iraq will not attack again would be unwise and unrealistic. If history teaches us anything, it is that we must resist aggression or it will destroy our freedoms. Appeasement does not work. As was the case in the 1930s, we see in Saddam Hussein an aggressive dictator threatening his neighbors.
The first American aircraft refueled above the Saudi desert. Saddam Hussein had never expected to see forces from America, the great ally of Israel, operating from Arab soil. But the invasion had turned both Western and Arab governments against Iraq. Soon, British, French, and Egyptian troops arrived, the beginnings of a coalition of 30 countries. Iraq's intelligence chief warned if war began, Iraq would lose. Saddam was furious.
None of us dared say withdraw from Kuwait. None of us. Saddam said, "You're acting as if you're salesmen for Western arms and technology. If it's God's will, victory will be ours."
Saddam rounded up foreigners in Kuwait as hostages. He hoped to intimidate the British and American publics. But his encounter with 7-year-old Stuart Lockwood served only to inflame them.
Does Stuart get his milk?
Yes, he does.
He patted me on the head and ruffled my hair. I was scared because of the soldiers.
Are you getting your milk, Stuart?
My throat was going all shivering and all that. And I goes, "Oh, no, it's going to get me," or something like that. "You're going to put me in this room forever with my mum and dad and my brother." I felt really nervous.
Saddam ruled Kuwait as he'd always ruled Iraq, with terror. The UN imposed sanctions and called on Saddam to withdraw. Instead, he sent 250,000 soldiers into Kuwait. Kuwait's wealth was systematically plundered. At one hospital, premature babies were left to die as soldiers looted incubators for Iraqi hospitals.
They go to the incubators and they pull the baby out. The Iraqi soldiers, they remove 9 to 11 babies from the incubators, and within 2 to 5 days, 5 babies expired from this accident.
Some Kuwaitis tried to fight back. But after the car bombs came reprisals.
They started killing Iraqi soldiers, kidnapping them and killing them. Saddam gave an order to attack any area from which a single shot was fired, so that's what we did.
The fledgling resistance movement was soon broken. The methods used allowed Bush to elevate the struggle into a moral crusade.
Summary executions, routine torture, Hitler revisited. America will not stand aside. The world will not allow the strong to swallow up the weak.
Saddam Hussein paid his first visit to Kuwait. George Bush had authorized the CIA to start recruiting Iraqi dissidents to overthrow him. America's equivalent of the SAS, Delta Force, was on standby to go into Iraq and kidnap him. But Saddam's security was too good. President Bush moved closer to war. He met Mikhail Gorbachev to ask the Soviet Union not to stand in the way if America went to war with Iraq. Iraq was an old ally of the Soviet Union. But Gorbachev agreed. The Cold War had just ended. Gorbachev did not want to risk his relationship with America.
Very good. Thank you.
This was a key meeting. A country had been occupied. If at that point in history we had not been able to deal with that situation, everything else we had worked for would have been null and void.
Without the Soviet Union on board, we never would have been able to marshal the international coalition that we were able to build up. It just gave a completely different dynamic to the whole effort. Instead of being an effort, let's say, by the United States and the United Kingdom to eject Iraq from Kuwait, it was an effort by the entire international community.
But Gorbachev wasn't willing to write a blank check. He added an important proviso.
We agreed with all the Security Council resolutions. We would do everything possible to force Iraq to accept them. We did not rule out the use of military force as a final resort, but all of us must search for a political settlement to avoid war.
С тем, чтобы не довести все-таки до военного конфликта.
This is U.S. Navy warship, Channel 14. Can you tell us what country your flag does under?
The need to bind the Soviets into the coalition dominated American tactics during the first flashpoint. 2 Iraqi tankers tried to sneak past 50 warships from 12 countries, enforcing United Nations sanctions. At the President's holiday home in Maine, a crisis meeting. From London, Mrs. Thatcher argued the tankers should be sunk, but the President sided with the Soviet request to backpedal.
The President decided that we would let the ships go, and so he called Prime Minister Thatcher to tell her that. And she says, "Well, George, all right, I'll accede to this one, but this is no time to go wobbly."
The first time you actually go to the use of force is quite a decision for the person who has to authorize it. And so you do tend to say, well, look, let's just see if there's anything else we can do. And so this was the reason why I said, look, George, this is no time to go wobbly. We'll do it this time, but we can't fall at the first fence. Just this time.
A week later, King Hussein of Jordan came to seek British support for a face-saving deal for Saddam. The king was an old ally of the West, but he was also close to Saddam. He feared a war would engulf Jordan. Mrs. Thatcher was implacable.
The meeting started with my speaking to her of my views and my attempts and my frustrations, and then she was very quiet for a long period of time, and then she gave me her responses.
He walked into a firestorm. She flew at him. She said that she thought he had calculated entirely wrongly. He had made the wrong decision by encouraging Iraq, by appearing to support Iraq. She gave him the toughest time I think he's ever had in his life.
I had to ask a question. Was it conceivable that you could ever be wrong?
Look, I was not discourteous. I was firm, very firm indeed.
But in Washington, there was division. The CIA, like British intelligence, reported sanctions might take 5 years to liberate Kuwait. The President began to see war as inevitable. But America's top general had grave misgivings. Colin Powell went to the White House to explain how long-term sanctions might work.
I laid out for him what a sanctions policy might look like and how it would work. He listened intently in that way he has, somewhat slouched in his chair with his chin slightly down. And his response was, well, Colin, that's all very, very interesting. It's good to consider all options, but I just don't think we're going to have time for sanctions to work.
But even after this meeting, Colin Powell would continue to argue against his president's line. 2 weeks later, in the Pentagon, Powell spoke with a top British commander.
Colin Powell said to me that he would be prepared to give sanctions a considerable time to work. And I said, well, how long are we talking about? To my astonishment, Colin Powell said, well, I would give them up to 2 years to work. He said, I don't think we should mount a military operation for at least that length of time, if that's what it takes for the sanctions to work, which he was confident that they would, because he felt there was a real risk of perhaps winning the war, but losing the peace in the Middle East.
Sanctions had only been at work for about a month, a little over a month. It wasn't clear whether they would have a desired effect. I was prepared to wait and see.
The president and his generals were on a collision course. In the desert, under appalling conditions, were troops from America, Britain, France, and the Arab coalition. They couldn't stay indefinitely. The president feared his coalition might collapse before Saddam's determination buckled. He told the generals to brief him on how they would take back Kuwait. It was an order that infuriated Norman Schwarzkopf. The troops he commanded had been sent to defend Saudi Arabia.
Everybody's saving lots of money right now, sir. No kidding.
Schwarzkopf believed there weren't enough of them to storm Kuwait's defenses and defeat an army of occupation which outnumbered them 2 to 1. He feared Bush's impatience might lead to military disaster.
God, they're great, aren't they? Colin called me and said, I want you to send an offensive option back. And I objected strongly. I said, look, I've told everybody all along we do not have the forces on the ground to conduct an offensive option.
My view was, well, that's all right, it's a work in progress. Bring it back to the United States. Let us brief it, and we'll all see where we are.
This was an effort, however conscious or unconscious, to basically say, this is going to be a near-run thing, and the casualties are going to be very high, and maybe we ought not do this. I think that there was very little enthusiasm in the American military for, in fact, throwing Saddam out of Kuwait militarily.
I wasn't trying to frighten them. I wanted to make sure they understood the significance of the operation we were thinking about. This wasn't going to be just a simple walk in the woods, drop a few bombs, and they'll all go home the way the Egyptians and the Saudis and the Turks were telling my political colleagues. And these were all gentlemen who had never really been in a major war. And so what I was trying to do is make sure they understood what we were doing and the difficulties of what we were doing, especially when it came to a ground plan. And I think the ground plan is what scared them all to death.
That night, there was a crisis of confidence at the heart of the administration. The politicians wondered if the right generals were in command.
And I went immediately to Cheney and said, this can't happen. If this is what we're going to get, then we'll just have to find a different way to do the military planning.
I shared Brent's concern, and I wanted to send a message through the organization that said, guys, we mean business. Now, one way or another, we're going to get an option put together that allows us to launch offensive action to go after the Iraqis.
What I told them was, don't panic. This is a solvable problem, and we will come up with a plan that you will find workable.
Colin Powell rushed to Saudi Arabia to meet Schwarzkopf. They knew that back in Washington, Dick Cheney was forming his own team to plan an offensive in case they dragged their feet. Schwarzkopf laid out what he believed was needed if the president wanted war. He asked Powell to support him.
When Colin came over for his briefing, I pointed out all of my trepidations. And the conclusion of that was Colin said, okay, if you are going to be required to attack, you will have the forces that you need. That was very reassuring to me.